So good evening, everyone, and welcome to IMCC. I want to talk tonight about the subject we talk about often here, which is separation, bridging separation, and with specific regard to prejudice and specifically racism. Some of you know from my past talks that I am descended from a slaveholding family. My maternal great-great-grandfather owned over 100 human beings in pre-Civil War Louisiana. And as a result of that, his progeny, which include me, accrued all kinds of benefits, privilege, doors opening. You can just imagine in terms of opportunity, education, good schools, doors opening, voices being heard, whereas the majority of the descendants of the enslaved persons there struggled mightily in the Deep South with issues of oppression, white terrorism, lynchings, denied the right to vote, denied educational opportunities, denied the opportunity to own property, poverty, oppression, the list goes on and on. So the issues of race, racism, and anti-racism are issues that are, for which I feel a very strong affinity. It's an issues I've struggled with my whole life, knowing, or my whole adult life, young adult life, knowing the family history. So I'm going to revisit this topic tonight. We talk a lot at IMCC about bridging separation. Teresa talked about it a few weeks ago, and I want to take another go at it tonight. I want to do something a little differently. I'm going to give some background on separation and bridging separation, but then if you'll indulge me, I want to spend a little bit of time, maybe 15 minutes or so, talking about some of the science of racism, what we know about from the research, about its origins and what maintains it, and what we might do about it. And then we'll have some time, hopefully, for some questions and discussion. So as you know, if you've been around IMCC a while, we've made a strong commitment to dealing with the subject of racism and of separation not just in terms of race, but other disenfranchised groups, with those of us that have privilege due to the, either our gender or the color of our skin. And we continue, we have a number of racial affinity groups. Bev1 has done a phenomenal job organizing and leading that effort within our community. And the commitment has really been to bridging separation. And this is important. It's why the Buddha talked about taking refuge in the community, and the Sangha as a way of bridging separation and bringing people together. But as I talk about it tonight, I'm not talking about it just in terms of our IMCC community. I'm talking about it also in terms of the community of all humankind and actually all sentient beings, and bridging separation within the community of all creatures. Thich Nhat Hanh says, quote, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness." And then he goes on to explain in a little more detail how the awareness of the interdependence of everything in the universe provides us with deeper insights into the Buddha's teachings on all subjects. So that it's foundational that we talk about this interdependence, what he calls inner being, of all things in the universe. And one of the barriers to our feeling or experiencing this interdependence is this illusion of a separate self. We talk about the concept of non-self, but in simplest terms, if things are impermanent, as we know them to be, then we as humans don't remain the same forever. There's no fixed solid self there. There's no fixed me. I'm ever changing, ever evolving. I'm just an evolving organism. And Teresa described this well in her talk several weeks ago. So just to elaborate on that a little bit, there is no permanent entity within us. There is a stream of being. And as Teresa pointed out, there's trillions of cells and microbes which make us up and which are constantly dying and regenerating. So we're constantly in a state of death and rebirth, if you will, as opposed to the solid fixed personality or solid fixed self. And if we hold on to this belief in a separate solid self, then it's really hard to appreciate the interdependence and the interconnection of all phenomenon, all beings, all things in the universe, as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches. And this illusion of separateness, this illusion of separation, it's prevented us from knowing who we really are. It's prevented us from appreciating who we really are in terms of our interconnection. And to feel separate in that way, to hold on to that separate self, is to suffer. It's a source of attachment to that sense of separate self. If you think back to the Four Noble Truths, in the second noble truth, where attachment, clinging is the source of suffering, then the clinging to that notion of a separate self, as we often talk about, is to suffer. And try as we might to relieve that suffering, not so much from the perspective of trying to appreciate our interconnectedness, but by denying our deepest needs for connection, by pursuing material pursuits, by compulsive work, by compulsive activity. We're continually haunted by this dis-ease of separation. We can't take refuge or rest in our families or our communities. We continue to suffer from this illusion of separateness. And I would say generally in our culture, that many, if not most of us, feel fundamentally separate. We feel cut off from each other, and we feel disconnected from the natural world, which has real implications for what we're doing to the planet. So the illusion of separateness has very real world consequences. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about how I think it contributes to racism and other forms of prejudice. It contributes to all kinds of other ills in terms of the tendency that humans have to want more and more of whatever, to be acquisitive, and how that impacts our the well-being of the planet. So as I said, the greater the attachment to this fundamental sense of a solid self, the more we suffer. And the problem is twofold. It's both external, in terms of a lack of available opportunities in community, or a lack of available opportunities to really feel connected, to really bridge separation. But it's also internal, the way we hold ourselves back from surrendering to relationships, from surrendering to this notion that we're just part of all part of creation. And very often, this default position of clinging to a separate self, this experience of alienation, this experience of non-belonging, is often a consequence of early painful experiences, early trauma, little t trauma or big T trauma, that leads us to mistrust intimacy, mistrust closeness, and run away when the going gets tough in terms of relatedness to others and the natural world. The result of this is that we reject our common fate as interdependent, as interconnected. And if we accept this common fate and accept the reality of this interdependence, then the suffering diminishes. And this is not a concept that is unique to Buddhism. I mean, Christians talk about this. Those of us that were raised in the Christian tradition, you may recall this, the notion that about being one in the body of Christ. And I think that's the same notion, and it comes up in other faith traditions, but I think it's universal in the sense that most faith traditions, if not all of them, the main ones, talk about this interconnection and this interdependence. So with that all said, I want to talk about one of the most toxic forms of separation, that being racism. And lately it's been on everybody's radar, I think, more because of the killing of George Floyd back in May. The horrific video that we've all seen probably too many times of his death. But I would argue, and this goes back to what I started with about my own family history, that's only the most recent and most horrific recent manifestation of racism in the 400-year history of this nation, and racism that precedes the United States. But it's been with us for a long time. There's a lot more. I'm gratified that there's a lot more being talked about. The protests, I think, have really raised the awareness of lots of people in the white community. If you look at the polling, the support of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think really reflects that a lot of people's eyes have been opened because of the tragedy of George Floyd's death and the subsequent killings of Black Americans preceding his death and subsequent to his death. But his was really, I think, because of the video and the graphic nature of it. We know this has been going on for centuries, but I think seeing that video was a real wake-up call, a real shock to the system of white America. And if, you know, we would hope that he didn't die in vain, that being the case. So if you'll bear with me, I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into racism and other forms of prejudice tonight, and talk some about what the scientific research tells us about this very destructive human condition. And let me just say initially that science tells us that racism runs deep in the fabric of our cognitive networks. And it's driven by a number of factors. Fear of the other. This goes back to our evolutionary heritage, our tribal heritage in terms of the danger that other tribes pose. So it's deep within our cognitive networks. Fear of the other, objectification of the other, the inability to take perspective taking, to sort of take the perspective of the other, and avoidance of those that are different from us. So those are some of the sort of broad aspects of racism. But I would argue that and I think the research bears this out, that it's vastly deeper than darker than that. It's much more complicated than that. And the reason it's sometimes difficult to dig it out or target it is because it's not just about race. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but in fact, it's about a broader prejudice, race being an obvious manifestation of that. And I'm going to try to explain that in the next few minutes. There is a common core, and again, the science bears this out, which I'll share with you some of the specifics in a moment. A common core to all forms of prejudice towards stigmatized groups, whether that's Black people, immigrants, brown people, Native Americans, immigrants, I think I said gays, poor people, disabled people, women. I mean, just pick any group that's suffered. A number of years ago, several years ago, not a number of years ago, a group of psychologists began to look at measures of prejudice against, they picked five groups: African Americans, obese individuals, gay men, women, and people that were struggling with substance abuse. So those were the five target groups that they were looking at. And what we know is that if you ask people directly, you know, are you prejudiced against blacks? The social demands of the question are such that they're going to deny it. I mean, that may be less so in this age in which we live, but generally speaking, people are going to deny clear into questions which clearly would show them to be racist or prejudiced. And so these studies design the questions that are a little more subtle and nuanced, such things as, do you think that discrimination no longer exists in our culture? Do you think the minority group members are receiving undue benefits from society? Do you think gay marriage is harmful to traditional marriage? Ways that sort of indirectly getting at different forms of bias and discrimination. So they studied many subjects. They have them respond to these questionnaires, looking at their attitudes toward these five groups in this particular set of studies. And they're looking for a statistical indication after they crunch all the numbers of generalized prejudice. In other words, was there a common thread running through all of these various forms of prejudice that they could pinpoint? And the answer was a clear yes. There was a clear common thread running through prejudice towards African Americans, obese individuals, gay men, women, and substance abusers. And the name that they gave this, and forgive the jargon, is authoritarian distancing. Authoritarian distancing. And there's been a lot of studies, as you may know, on the authoritarian personality and need for power and control and so forth. But essentially what they defined authoritarian distancing is the implicit and virtually unconscious belief that you need to maintain psychological distance from and control over persons that you judge as the other. It's the implicit and virtually unconscious belief that you need to maintain psychological distance from and control over persons you judge as the other. So then they went a little bit further and they looked at psychological processes that predicted generalized prejudice, again, specifically racism, above and beyond the sort of obvious factors such as political beliefs or the need for social dominance. And they added measures of perspective taking, in other words, being able to walk in the other person's shoes or not, empathic concern, the presence or absence of empathic concern for others different than us, and the presence of or absence of psychological flexibility or inflexibility, what we call resilience, the ability to sort of bounce back from a psychologically disturbing experience. And the total of those factors, those five factors, political beliefs, need for social dominance, perspective taking, empathic concern, and psychological flexibility, accounted for about a third of all prejudiced attitudes. So it's not the full picture. But it was enough so that they could determine that the single most robust strategy for overcoming racism and other forms of prejudice is the need in individuals and all of us to foster the ability to take the perspective of other people. In other words, to walk in their shoes. And this is something we talk a lot about in terms of our teachings on compassion and empathy and loving kindness. to feel what it feels like to be the other person, and to not run away psychologically when the going gets tough, when it's difficult. So to foster the ability to take the perspective of other people, to feel what it feels like to be them, and to not run away when it gets tough. And this includes, and this is really an important point, it includes respecting cultural differences. Someone said to me fairly recently, someone that I thought was fairly knowledgeable on issues of race, they said, you know, I don't have a problem with Black people, but I have a problem with Black culture. Well, you know, to me, that just doesn't fly, because there's that how can you not respect cultural differences and still be accepting of others? So it really requires that we calm our judging mind in making judgments about different cultures, whether that's speech patterns, diet and food, fashion, music, lifestyle, whatever. We have to learn to respect those other cultures if we're going to overcome our own racism and prejudice. And I think that issue often gets lost in the discussion when we talk about overcoming racism or becoming anti-racist. It's really about cultivating true compassion and empathy and loving kindness for those that suffer from prejudice, for those that suffer from racism. It's about truly bridging separation. Now, this is not the whole story, needless to say, about racism. It involves lots of other things. As I said, those factors which I talked about from the research only accounted for a third of racist and prejudiced attitudes. It involves things like economic domination and wanting to hold on to privilege and social control and political power and hatred and animus toward others and so on. So it's a very complicated subject. But I think if we strive to cultivate true compassion, if we strive to cultivate empathy, if we respect cultural differences, if we learn to walk in the shoes of others who are different from us, then we're off to a good start in terms of our efforts to address our own inherent racism and the systemic racism that exists in the culture. It's really about seeing and appreciating and celebrating our common humanity, the common humanity of all humankind. And we really need to, this is where our practice comes in and our mindfulness comes in, to see the inner world as part of this picture, our own cognitive maps, our own reactivity, our own inherent racism, whatever, acknowledgement of privilege, acknowledge of all the benefits that accrue to me from the fact that my great-great-grandfather created wealth on the backs of enslaved persons, wealth and privilege that that accrued to his progeny. In preparing the talk, I ran across an interesting, just a brief aside here, an interesting point, which is that the same factors that I mentioned in terms of overcoming racism, empathy, the capacity to walk in the other person's shoes and so forth, also predict the degree to which people enjoy other people. In other words, those qualities, not surprisingly, foster connection and make us appreciate others and enjoy others. Objectification, dehumanization, racism is bad for the human heart. I think that's self-evident. Racists are simply less comfortable in their own skin. They tend to be highly shame-prone. They tend to be highly emotionally reactive. If you've seen any of the videos of the anti-mask folks flying off the handle when asked to wear a mask. There's been a whole bunch of that stuff on the internet. It's fairly disturbing. You get a sense of the reactivity of people that harbor racist and prejudiced attitudes, and how they objectify and dehumanize others, even to the point of irresponsibly not wearing masks and endangering others. So I think at this point where we are culturally is that what's going on is that the current situation, the circumstances, life as we're currently experiencing it, is really asking us at this moment, as these moments, to, in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick and others, to really take a knee in solidarity with oppressed groups, to really walk in their shoes, to really feel their pain. If you just imagine for a moment, or think about for a moment, what it would feel like to have a knee on your neck with your hands in handcuffs behind your back and you're unable to breathe, and then not run away from that. So let's sit for a moment, then I'll ring the bell. May we open our hearts to the pain and suffering of racism and other forms of prejudice. May we strive to reduce separation and heal the pain of racism. Thank you for your time and attention.